This is side 2 of the first tape made by Proctor W. Maynard relating various incidents of his boyhood in Hawarden, Iowa during the period around World War I. I suppose the outstanding memory that any boy of that period would have of the World War I period would be the 2 armistice days in 1918 at the end of the war. The first armistice day was, of course, a false report. I recall, I don't know whether we were in school or downtown or just what the circumstances of our being on the streets might be at that time. Perhaps it was due to the closing of schools because of the coal shortage. But for whatever reason, the report became widespread on, as I recall it, November 9th, that the armistice had been signed. And of course the town went wild. Everybody went wild. The farmers quit farming. They got on their horses or in their buggies or cars or whatever, came into town. Most of them were carrying shotguns and rifles, and they were shooting. And of course we were close enough to the cowboy country so that there would be a good deal of tradition of that sort of thing. Everybody was snake dancing around the streets. I remember we boys took excursions up on the side streets, the residential streets, and in those days many housewives had tubs hanging on their back sheds, and we didn't bother about who owned them or anything. We just grabbed the tubs and anything we could use to beat them and took them back downtown. I'm sure that the hardware store did a land office business on wash tubs after we'd gotten through commandeering whatever we could get as boys to join the parades downtown. There was just a general commotion and hubbub, and this was, as I recall it, true all across the country. The newspapers told stories of this kind of celebration everywhere. The big celebration was the false armistice day celebration of November 9th, when a bit later on we learned, probably toward evening, we learned that the report was not true, that the armistice had not yet been signed. And so when the true armistice day came on November 11th, the reaction of the community was somewhat more sober. Not too much so, but somewhat more sober than it had been on March 9th. There still was a great deal of snake dancing and shooting and into the air and parading around and that sort of thing, but nothing like the spontaneous outbursts that had characterized what came to be known as the false armistice day on November 9th. But I'm sure that anyone who was there at the time will never forget that. I'm also sure that anyone who remembers the VE Day armistice celebration in 1945 will also remember that the VE Day armistice was a very tame affair as compared with the armistice, the false and the true armistice day celebrations in 1918. The signing of the armistice in 1918 also led to one of the more unfortunate episodes of that period and had rather far-reaching long-run consequences in the community, even to this day. The Hawarden Main Street was a very wide main street. The band had an oversized hay wagon, which was used for a platform for any type of public speaking activity where the community was to gather down on the main street, and they could because the streets were very wide, and this provided a good platform. So the powers that be in the city decided that they would have a community Thanksgiving service sometime on one of the Sundays after November 11th. I don't remember just exactly which date it was, whether it was the next Sunday or a Sunday or two later. But at any rate, a community Thanksgiving service was to be held, a religious service, down on the main street. Two churches did not appear at the Thanksgiving service. One was the Catholic Church, which was predominantly an Irish Catholic church, although there were many other nationalities that also belonged. But they'd had their masses early, and the masses were over by the time that the Thanksgiving service was to be held, and quite a number of Catholics had come down for the services, so that nobody got very concerned about that. But during World War I, the pro-German suspicion was very pronounced. The feeling about Germans was very pronounced. There was a great deal of hate feeling toward Germans at that time. And the Missouri Synod German Lutheran Church did not come down to the community Thanksgiving service, but held their services in their own church at the same time that the community Thanksgiving service was to be held. And in the eyes of some of the less thoughtful men of the community, this was not right. And so a posse was formed, a double line of men, I suppose mostly the younger men. I don't recall just who it was, but many of the prominent individuals of the community formed a double line, marched up the street several blocks to the Missouri Synod German Lutheran Church, walked in on the congregation. It happened just at the time that they were having their communion service, which they held every Sunday, of course, and ordered them to come down to the community Thanksgiving service. The pastor of the church was a very level-headed man, and he recognized that this was a mob situation, a potentially dangerous situation, and so he advised the congregation to go quietly, so that a double line of businessmen and young men around town was formed with a German Lutheran congregation in between, and they were marched back down to the community Thanksgiving service location, as I've always said, in good Christian style. But at any rate, there were some pretty grim faces among the German Lutheran, the members of the German Lutheran Church. After the service was over, the pastor of the German Lutheran Church got up in the back seat of a touring car. Most cars in those days were touring cars rather than sedans, as almost every car is today. He got up in the back seat of the touring car and started to tell the people that were still hanging around there, and my father was on one side of the car, I was on the other side of the car, what he thought of them as in terms of American citizenship. He had become an American citizen and was very loyal to the country, and he had a point, a very real point. My father and I never agreed as to what happened. As I saw it, the cashier of the bank, of the First National Bank, took a poke at the German Lutheran pastor. My father said no, that wasn't what happened, that what happened was that the cashier of the bank, Al Hawarden, attempted to pull the German Lutheran pastor down because he was afraid that he would start a riot. And it might well have happened, of course. While he was being more or less wrestled, not very hard, but more or less wrestled down from the back seat where he had been standing. Another individual took a poke at him. I have always heard that it was Alf Morgan, but I do not know whether that is correct or not. At any rate, someone took a poke at the German Lutheran minister. The bank officials realized during the noon hour what was going to happen. And so a posse was organized, I suppose you could call it that, to go to Sioux City, and there must have been some telephoning involved because a convoy of several cars, I remember Leon Carlin was driving the money car, went to Sioux City. These were supposedly the best drivers, the fastest drivers. There was a car in front, and they were heavily armed. There was a car behind the money car, and they were heavily armed, and there were heavily armed individuals in the money car. It was about 45, 50 miles to Sioux City. The roads were, of course, dirt roads. And it was realized that it would be well known that this convoy was going to Sioux City to round up all the money that they could. Of course, most banks had time vaults, and so money couldn't be gotten from bank vaults until the vaults opened the next day. But the businessmen, both in Hawarden and in Sioux City, rounded up all the money that they could get, all that could be spared from Sioux City, from whatever source it might be. I don't know where they obtained the various amounts of money. As far as possible, they tried to get silver dollars. Silver dollars were rather widely used in that part of Iowa, even more widely used in northeastern Nebraska, where I taught, because William Jennings Bryan had run on his Cross of Gold campaigns, and the silver dollar was still widely used, widely popular in the area. So they rounded up all the money they could, preferably dollar bills and silver dollars, and brought back to Hawarden. In the meantime, somebody had gotten in touch with the Federal Reserve Bank. I do not know now, right here with the facilities in front of me, whether Hawarden was still a part of the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank or whether it had been transferred to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, as did happen at some point along in here. But at any rate, the noon train was to bring in additional money from the appropriate Federal Reserve Bank. So Monday morning, the inevitable happened. Every German for miles around there who had any money in the First National Bank came in to get his money out of the First National Bank. The other two banks, the Hawarden State Bank and the Farmer State Bank, agreed not to accept any abnormal deposits during this period of time. 2 tellers were put on each window, and one teller was required to count to the second teller. The second teller was required to count to the regular teller. The regular teller was required to count to the customer and to require the customer to count back. Usually this meant 3 to 5 countings of whatever money was being withdrawn. As far as possible, they paid in silver dollars and dollar bills. And the idea, of course, was to slow down the payout of money and the withdrawal of money until the money came in from the noon train. Various individuals who came in, I remember one, Herman Witt, who lived 4 miles out in the country, had come in with a horse and buggy. And he, as I remember the figure, had 1,700 silver dollars. He had to go and buy a pail and a coal hod, as I remember it, and he carried those conspicuously, and they were very heavy, to each of the other two banks, and they wouldn't accept his deposits, so he had to come back and rent a safety deposit box in the bank that he was withdrawing from, and put his money in the safety deposit box for the time being. Subsequently, the run was stopped for that period of time, but subsequently the Germans and many of the Dutch in the community, in the area around there, the farming area around there, just quietly withdrew their money from the bank, and in the early 1920s, with the depressed agricultural prices, cattle prices, and so on, the sharp drop in them, the bank found it necessary to close and reorganize. This, as I remember it, this bank had to again go through one or two more reorganizations, and eventually was closed down altogether. It remained it had been one of the strongest banks in the county. Thereafter, it remained one of the weaker banks in the county. Merle Stone, who was a stockholder in the bank on the board of directors and editor of the Hawarden Independent, and I never agreed as to what role all this played in the ultimate failure of the First National Bank. I maintained that it was just a quiet, steady hemorrhage that ultimately destroyed the bank. They tried several cashiers to restore the confidence of the rural community in it, but apparently the prejudice about the episode was passed on from one generation to the next, and they never did succeed in completely eliminating the influence of it. Merle Stone felt that it was more the agricultural marketing conditions and farm price conditions, things of that sort. But I would still contend, because I did quite an intensive study of the published quarterly statements of the bank, that I would contend that it was that hemorrhage due to that episode on the community Thanksgiving service that ultimately brought down the bank. I suppose most people have heard about the influenza epidemic that occurred in 1918 and 1919, and the terrible loss of life that accompanied that. This was a truly worldwide pandemic, one of the last ones we've had. Since then, the worldwide disease control facilities have been developed to alert health authorities worldwide to the possibility of such pandemics and to take immediate steps to prevent them. But at that time, there was no such organization. Hawarden achieved some notoriety in this pandemic, this influenza pandemic, because of the success of two of its local osteopathic doctors, Dr. A.W. and Ida Peterson. They had been trained in Sweden, I believe, as masseurs. They had come to this country, had learned osteopathy at the Still College of Osteopathy, and practiced osteopathy. When the influenza epidemic hit, according to Ripley's column, believe it or not column report later on, Dr. Peterson and his wife had over 500 influenza cases and never lost a patient. Supposedly, he was the only doctor in the country that had that perfect record as far as influenza cases were concerned. I can always remember hearing Dr. Peterson. He was very hard of hearing. He had one of the earliest of the hearing aids, but it wasn't particularly successful. and he had a high-pitched nasal voice because he couldn't really hear the way his voice did sound. And I can always remember his advice. Go to bed, get lots of rest, drink lots of water, and keep the bowels open. This was his standard prescription for the influenza epidemic. And he was, of course, extremely successful. And the influenza epidemic hit our family along with everybody else, but fortunately it so worked out that one of the parents, I do not remember whether it was my father or my mother, came down with it first, and they got so that they could manage to get around and keep the fires going, keep a little soup broth on the stove, while the other parent had it. And then about the time that parent got so that they couldn't do anything, I began to get back, either I hadn't yet got it or I got back on my feet. I was the oldest of the children, and so we were able to get by. It was simply impossible to to hire a nurse anywhere. Every nurse and it was fully occupied. There was no possibility of getting one. Every doctor was working night and day, and you just simply had to take care of yourself. That was all. I think my father did talk with Dr. Peterson. He gave him Dr. Peterson's standard prescription, and as far as we were concerned, it worked. But it was a very serious illness. You were terribly weak after you got through with it, and it was extremely difficult to keep the fires going, keep the house heated, and yet keep a little, usually soup stock, food going so that there could be some nourishment. Somewhere in this period, too, there occurred the coal shortage, the coal car shortage, and the necessity for the closing of the Hawarden schools for a period of about 6 weeks in the fall and early winter. We, of course, had to make up that time by going to school on Saturdays and on into June in the following summer. In order to, I don't know whether the state law at that time required so many days of education, but the board, the Hawarden School Board, did intend to provide so many days of education, and to make up for that lost time, we had to do that. We small children were, of course, not happy about it, but recognized that it was necessary. What had happened, of course, is that the railroad system had pretty much broken down. It was under the government had taken over, and I have always felt that the railroad managements, in order to make the government operation look as bad as possible, deliberately mismanaged the handling of the cars. But whatever was the case, the railroad system broke down, cars piled up in the wrong places, and it was not possible to get rolling stock to move coal from the coal mines to the various cities. We had a very bad winter, and that didn't help matters any at all. Anyway, the school board ran out of coal, and they found it necessary to close down for a 6 weeks period, and which we liked at the time, but was to our eventual disgust the following spring and summer. While I'm on the subject of government operation of the railroads during that period, I might well talk about one of the summers, perhaps 1919, 1920, somewhere along in there. Might even have been 1921, although I think it was probably 1920. Labor was still critically short in many areas, And so many of the high school students and young boys around town, teenage boys around town, were able to get jobs in the railroad yards. Butch Meter, some of the huskier boys worked on the section. I got a job keeping passenger coaches clean, and I'd have to sit around the yards for 8 hours a day and wait for the passenger trains to come in. Then I'd have to sweep out the cars, wash the windows, and straighten up around. One of the rather interesting sidelights on that was that Hawarden, being a railroad division center on the Northwestern Railroad, had an ice house. The ice was necessary to ice the fruit cars that were coming through from Louisiana and Texas and California and Florida and places like that, carrying fresh fruit. So these cars would come into the railroad yards on freight trains in the late afternoon, evening. The night crews had various ways of breaking the seals on the car doors without it being too apparent that this had been done. And so the night crews would break into the watermelon cars, get a number of watermelons, take them over to the ice house, which was full of sawdust, and big chunks of ice had been cut from the Big Sioux River up above the dam and hauled there during the winter months, the winter before. And these watermelons would be buried in the sawdust for the night crew to have nice iced watermelon the next night. We people who worked in the yards in the daytime learned that we could take the pike poles that were used to move the ice blocks around and jab around in the sawdust until we hit one of these watermelons, or several of these watermelons actually, and then we would have some nice ice-cold watermelon with a little sawdust mixed in the following day. And there was a continual warfare going on between the night crews and the day crews over that. And of course, the whole thing was involved a kind of theft that good railroad managements would avoid, but this was government operation and nobody seemed to care very much. We boys that worked in the yards were getting unusually good money for us. It was unheard of amounts of money. I don't remember now whether it was 50 cents an hour or $1 an hour. Whatever it was unusually good money, and this was a day in which when you had the money to do it, young fellows bought silk shirts and blew their money that way. I remember Butch Meter and Lloyd Morgan, a number of others like that, fellows like that, many of them on the football team, working in the yards in various capacities and making unusually good pay for the young people at that time of the economy. I am sure that if I sat around with a number of men who were my boyhood contemporaries, and we got to reminiscing, that we could come up with many more vignettes of this World War I period. But this completes the list that I had initially put down to provide paragraphs, if you will, about the World War I period. And I think I will shift my gears now and go through a rather substantial list of just general vignettes of episodes that I remember over the years as a boy from and up until along in the 1920s or even occasionally in the 1930s. So these will not be organized around one time period quite so much. I think before I get too far away from a time reference, it would be well for me to put down in tape 2 or 3 topics that I remember from either my mother's relating to me, things that Grandma Maynard had told her about the prairie years before they moved to Elk Point and Beersford and Hawarden, or things that I heard my grandmother tell about. My grandmother Maynard died when in my senior year in high school, 1923, but the last few years she didn't tell me as many things as I now wish she had, and I, of course, did not realize the importance of asking her about many things that I would like to have known more about. So I will have to do a number of these things somewhat second-hand. Grandma Maynard and Grandpa Maynard first came into Sioux City in 1867 on one of the first regularly scheduled passenger trains into Sioux City. They went up the Grandpa Maynard may have come first in 1867 and then gone back, and Grandma Maynard and Grandpa Maynard may have come in 1868 rather than 1867. But at any rate, they were there shortly after the Civil War. They went up the Missouri River to a tract of land about 3 miles northwest of Elk Point, Dakota Territory. Grandpa Maynard had grown up in northern Pennsylvania, and he was looking for a tract that would be close to water and would be close to trees and would be good soil too. This was Missouri River bottom soil. I understand that a good deal of the farm in later years was washed away because the Missouri River changed its course and took some of the land with it. But at any rate, he homesteaded 160 acres, and I've always believed that he also got 160 acres under the Tree Planting Act and 160 acres as a Civil War veteran. I'm not quite sure about those last 2 items, but he did homestead 160 acres of land, I know, and proved up on it under the requirements of the homestead law. He maintained, as my father always said, very good relations with the Indians. The Indians were mostly on reservations, but now and then some of the Indians would leave the reservations and come down to Sioux City, and some of them would stop at Grandpa Maynard's farmhouse. He had built a frame farmhouse as one of the first things he did, and they would stop there. Grandma Maynard has told my mother about how she would be working in the kitchen, and it'd be a hot summer day, and the door would be open, and the first thing she'd know, she'd hear a slight cough or something of that sort, and look over to the door, and here would be 2 or 3 of these Indians, I believe they were called blanket Indians, sitting on the doorstep, saying nothing whatever, just sitting there. She, at first it scared the daylights out of her, but she learned that all she had to do was to give them some food and give them some water, and that they would go on their way, and they never did bother Grandpa Maynard's and Grandma Maynard's property, largely because he my father said, always tried to treat them respectfully and fairly. My father, as a young boy, growing up on the prairie, was always somewhat concerned about the stories of Indian massacres. Even as a mature man, he still was very much interested in the location of massacres and massacre sites. The Spirit Lake Massacre at Spirit Lake, Iowa, the Stillwater Massacre, these were all very real things. When I spent some time at the CMTC camp in Minneapolis in the summer of 1921 and 1922, he questioned me about whether I'd had an opportunity to get down to the site of the Stillwater Massacre or not. When we went out to Colorado to the wheatland there one time, he purposely came back through one part of Colorado to see the site of the Beecher Island Massacre, because that had occurred during his boyhood. So massacres, Indian massacres of whites, were a very real concern to him as a young man, as a young boy growing up on the prairie. I never heard Grandma Maynard talk about them in any way, but especially at the time we stopped at the Beecher Island Massacre site, I do remember my father revealing a very intense interest in it. One other aspect of this, of these prairie years for my grandparents and my father, is of some interest too. He had grown up, as I say, as in northern Pennsylvania, right near the New York line, a little west of the center of Pennsylvania, Potter County actually, and had at some point along the line learned how to make cheese. So one of the things he did that gave him a little edge over many of the other homesteaders on the prairie was that he got a herd of milk cows. And my father spent a great deal of time in the saddle as a boy herding these milk cows on the prairie. Now, milk cows at the Maynard farm, 35 or 40 miles from Sioux City, with only a very small population in Elk Point, wouldn't seem like a very paying proposition. But what he did was to milk these cows, turn the milk into cheese, and store the cheese in what later on came to be called a storm cellar or a cyclone cellar. And then when he needed cash to pay taxes or something else along that line, he'd take a wagon load of cheese to Sioux City. It was usually a 3-day trip, one day to get to Sioux City, one day for selling the cheese and buying the supplies, and another day to get back. And so Grandma and my father and his sister were alone during that period of time. I know my father said that they sometimes were worried about the Indians, but although it sometimes happened that Indians did come through at those times, they never bothered them at all. But this fact that he knew how to make cheese and could turn the prairie grasses into a cash crop through the cheese-making process did give him somewhat of a head start over many other settlers in the grasshopper years and other times like that when many of the homesteaders had to give up. He was able to survive. One vignette that I'm sure some of the older people will remember is that of Frank Jaco selling his newspapers in the post office, which was located next to the meat market in what is now the Hawarden Independent office. Frank Jaco, for many years, sold daily and particularly Sunday newspapers at that point. In later years, Jaco had a sore on his cheek, which I later learned was a skin cancer, and I remember one time my father telling me that I must not buy newspapers from Frank Jaco anymore. I, at that time, didn't realize what a skin cancer was, and I didn't understand just why I was not to do that, but I later on did realize that he was concerned, as anybody would be, about the possibility of contacting and acquiring a skin cancer, because nobody knew how the cancer was transmitted at that time. Still another little vignette that I might mention is that of Captain Myers and his mobile bucksaw. Captain Frank Myers was sometimes, some years, janitor of the high school in the old stone high school, and always he was a kind of a general handyman around town. He was kind of a genius with mechanical equipment. He had at some point along the line acquired an old gasoline engine. I assume it was gasoline. It might have been kerosene, but anyway, he had an engine of a one-lunger engine. He had mounted that on a frame with 4 wheels on it. He built a frame, mounted it on it. He had a saw blade for sawing up wood on it, but he also had a gear shift system and a steering system whereby he could shift belts, or I think there was a sprocket chain too involved. I don't remember just exactly how it was geared up, but at any rate he had a system whereby he could shift probably belts over to a drive mechanism that would move this vehicle slowly down the street. And so whenever he had a job of bucksawing to do for somebody who wanted to cut up some trees, or had bought a load of wood from someone along the river or something of that sort, he'd get this vehicle out and move to it, and then he'd shift the gears again over to the saw blade, and he'd cut up the wood for him, and then take off back to his home. He always had one of the neatest homes in town, just north of the north and a little, well, just across from the Methodist church, actually, just west of the Methodist church. He always had a very neat home. He was a very hard-working individual, rather uncommunicative individual as far as we young boys were concerned, but not unfriendly, but not particularly friendly either. One other episode that I might mention is the Catholic school fire. Our house at that time was just south of the Catholic school on the corner, and I remember being seated on the toilet in the bathroom one day, and when I heard the fire truck, the fire whistle in the fire truck, and pretty quick I looked out the window and saw that the Catholic school was on fire and that there were a lot of people around there. I, of course, was, like any small boy, very much interested in the fire and watched it. The upper part of the school was badly burned. Eventually the school was cut in half,